I'm Phil Cornish, your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense, and we're back today for a new program. We're going to recapture a little bit of something we did before. We're going to talk about the aftermath of COVID, what we hope is the aftermath of COVID, and how has our government handled that, and particularly our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. We're going to come back and talk about that. Welcome back. I'm Phil Cornish, your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense, and we have a program today that's going to revisit a topic that we touched on previously, and that is the topic of COVID and its impact on Canada and the world. And in particularly, we focused on the response of our government, led by Justin Trudeau, primarily, being the federal component. And we talked about the nature of how Mr. Trudeau conducted himself in the COVID crisis. Well, I want to revisit that topic today and consider an evaluation, an assessment of what Mr. Trudeau did. Now, I think it's fair to say right from the beginning point that our media generally came to the defense of Mr. Trudeau and the federal government. They largely silenced critics. They skewed the perspective dramatically in favor of the Trudeau government. And the more correct perspective, in my view, has not really been told. So I want to delve into that a little deeper and see if we can talk about some of the things that took place. So the starting point that we talked about in a prior program was the Freedom Convoy that went to Toronto, or I'm sorry, went to Ottawa. And the reality there is that the government crackdown on them really cannot be supported. What we know historically is that Canadian governments have been prepared to grant great allowance for other forms of protests. I have some articles with me today that talk about the protest over the railways by Indigenous people, the Canadian National Railways blockade by Mohawks and the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in British Columbia, and how Mr. Trudeau was perfectly willing to negotiate with them, but yet he told us very clearly he was not going to negotiate with any of the COVID protesters, who certainly carried themselves about peaceably. So is there a double standard? Is the Trudeau government prepared to treat some people one way and other people another? The same thing happened previously with the Oka and Ipperwash situations with Native protesters. And so it leads to the question of, is there a double standard in terms of how the Trudeau government and governments generally have dealt with protesters? So the invoking of the Emergencies Act by the Trudeau government certainly was an overreach. We found that there was considerable controversy over that when we learned that Marco Mendicino had invoked the need for that act without the request of the police. Originally, we were led to believe that the police had requested it. Then we find out that the Emergencies Act, in fact, was done unilaterally by the federal government, and in fact, trammeled upon the rights of Canadians in ways that heretofore has been unseen, including seizing bank accounts, seizing vehicles in ways that overreached really what was what was required in the circumstances. So the Trudeau government cannot be well spoken of in its handling of the convoy crisis. What about some other factors? Well, we know just recently a story in the news has told us that half of all vaccines ordered from one manufacturer have had to be destroyed. 13.6 million doses of vaccine are being discarded, thrown away, because the Trudeau government has overpurchased and has not allocated or used them in efficient and appropriate ways, and has wasted billions of dollars of taxpayer money. And then what about the programs that the government provided for financial relief during COVID? The CERB program was the primary one, but there were some others that went along with it. So what we find out there is that there has been considerable fraud that occurred because of that. And so we know, for example, that there were about 11 million recipients of COVID benefits that come from taxpayers, that come from you and me. So virtually 1/3 of all Canadians, at least, received some form of benefit. And what we find out is that many of those were done fraudulently. And for example, we know that hundreds of thousands of 15 to 17-year-olds to the tune of $600 million was paid out of taxpayer money. Now, you have to question, why would 15 to 17-year-olds be appropriate beneficiaries of CERB benefits? Presumably they would be living at home at the age of 15 to 17. Why should they need that kind of benefit? And so what we find, I think, is that this was an ill-conceived benefit program sponsored by the Trudeau government, but really by us, because it comes from our taxpayer dollars. It comes out of your pocket and it comes out of my pocket. And so when this fraud occurs, which has been soundly documented in Canada and in the United States as well, by the way, that tells us there's something wrong. And here's another interesting statistic that just came out in the news just within the last weeks that further supports that concern. And that is the idea that it's been shown statistically that Canadian incomes actually went up, increased during the year 2020. Why? Because the pandemic benefits received from the federal government actually increased incomes of Canadians to higher than it would have been before the pandemic. So that leaves you, of course, scratching your head. If you're getting paid better than you were before, how is that a reasonable benefit program to be giving? It sounds to me like that is grossly excessive waste of taxpayer money. So the Trudeau government does not account for itself well in terms of its handling of COVID benefits that were paid out as well. And then we know that the government debt, the federal debt, has increased dramatically, particularly since COVID. And so we know in 2020, the government federal deficit was $327 billion. And in 2021, another $113 billion in deficit. So that leaves us now with over a $1 trillion debt. How does that translate? Well, that's $6 million an hour of interest. And of course, now we know interest payments are getting higher. I guess Mr. Trudeau didn't envision that with the false economy, the economic engineering of the Bank of Canada and the federal government that sought to artificially keep interest rates low. Well, that couldn't go on forever, and now we see why. And the way we're going to pay for that is by inflation. And so Mr. Trudeau has to take, in large measure, responsibility for that, together with his appointed overseers of the Bank of Canada and Tiff Macklin. So our debt now is $30,000 per Canadian. So these kind of debts, I'm going to submit to you, are never repayable. And sure, there are other countries in the world that have large debts as well. The point is just the same. These debts can never realistically be repaid without doing absolutely horrific damage to the Canadian economy and to its citizens. So the growth, the burgeoning growth of our deficits and debt lies at the feet of the Trudeau government. And then we know as well the scandals Mr. Trudeau has been involved in that range from SNC Lavalin to We Charity violations to his ethical violations with the trip with the Aga Khan, his appearing in blackface at more than one time in his life. All of these speak to the integrity of Mr. Trudeau. They speak to his personal character, and he does not come off well. So what is it about Mr. Trudeau that is problematic? I'm going to suggest to you that his notion of being a woke, feminist prime minister is at the root of that, and that lies at some of the earlier elements of our theses that I've developed in our earlier programs, the idea of the advent of postmodernism, the elevation of feelings, the abandonment of eschatology, all that is wrapped up in critical race theory and wokeism and the kind of philosophy that drives Mr. Trudeau has been divisive to our country. It is fracturing our country. And so we know that Mr. Trudeau in the past has said that he admires the totalitarian type of control of the economy found in the Chinese government. He has admired Fidel Castro, who of course his father did. And so we see the apple didn't fall far from the tree with Justin Trudeau and his father, former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. So that's why we find the sharp divide that Mr. Trudeau apparently doesn't understand between his elitist, woke form of government versus the populists that have rallied against him. And so we find that the populists today that simply want to restore traditional and sound values to government, to our society, have been corrupted by the elite wokeism of Justin Trudeau. So I have a little phrase that I've coined for Mr. Trudeau. I would call him the emotive, mendacious, silver spoon, flower child, bleeding heart Liberal Prime Minister. So all of that is just telling us that Mr. Trudeau is that emotionally driven, emotive person who has had a very silver spoon lifestyle that really has developed from what he's learned from his father, from that 60s and 70s generation, that has led him to his wokeism and his thinking that is fracturing our country today and causing us hardship in many ways, economically, socially, and so on. So how can we sum up our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and his performance, which deserves evaluation? Politicians need to be evaluated. So how do we conclude or summarize Mr. Trudeau? Well, I hope I've demonstrated today that there have been some serious ethical and integrity concerns, some serious financial mismanagement issues, some concerns over his use of the law and tactics to trample upon the rights of citizens, all guided by his wokest, elitist agenda, which gives no time for populist, for the common citizen. And so that's why we've seen many people rally against Mr. Trudeau, because they simply want to return to traditional values that are not in harmony with the new wokeism and the elitism that we see in Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Trudeau deserves censure. He deserves to be criticized for his performance. And I hope that this program has accomplished that in a very fair and balanced way. Thank you for listening.